My name is Martin Blake, and I turned 72 last fall. I still remember the early mornings on my family's wheat farm in Callaway County, Nebraska. The mist rising off the fields, the distant crow of a rooster insisting that dawn had arrived, whether I was ready or not. My parents. Walter and Josephine Blake woke me with gentle hands and stronger words. Change the world with your hands, son, not the ground. They were simple folk, drenched in honesty and grit, who believed a boy could do more than follow the plow. I was their only child, and every sunrise found me at my father's elbow. He taught me how to read the sky by its color, how to smell rain in the air, how to coax life from hard-packed soil. My mother, soft-spoken but resolute, showed me that books could expand a person's horizons far beyond fence posts and fields. At night, she'd read aloud passages from Thoreau or Shakespeare, her voice a warm, steady flame against the chill of the farmhouse kitchen. Those stories awakened something in me, a hunger to build, create, and connect. School in our one-room rural schoolhouse was a mix of rigorous lessons and endless chores, hauling coal for the stove, fetching water from the well, mending torn textbooks with frayed hands. I loved geometry's neat lines and physics' clear laws, but I also savored the smell of fresh hay and the taste of just-pulled carrots. By high school graduation, I'd decided I wanted to build more than barns and silos. I dreamed of designing structures that stood as beacons of community places where people shopped, laughed, and shared stories, much like the ones my mother read to me. When I left for the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, I carried my parents' faith like a talisman in my pocket. Engineering school was a whirlwind of equations and late-night study sessions, but it also introduced me to a world of possibilities beyond the flat plains I'd known since birth. One evening, I slipped into the library to escape an exam meltdown. I found myself among shelves of literature as sprawling and intricate as any city skyline. It was there, between rows of leather-bound classics, that I first saw Eleanor. She was perched on a ladder reaching for a copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, her brown hair tied back with a ribbon that matched the gentle curve of her smile. She wore round spectacles that slid down her nose every few sentences, and she had a way of pausing to consider each word before tucking it under her arm. When I asked if she needed help, she looked at me with clear, curious eyes and said, "Only if you promise not to judge my taste in poetry." That was the beginning of everything. Eleanor and I spent that spring semester tracing the paths of rivers on geological maps, debating the merits of modernist novels in dusty seminar rooms, and walking campus paths shaded by elm trees that whispered secrets overhead. She introduced me to Faulkner's Southern Gothic worlds. I showed her the fundamentals of load-bearing walls and steel reinforcements. In late May, beneath a sky streaked with pink and gold, I asked her to stand with me at the edge of the engineering quadrangle. I held her hand and told her I wanted more than textbooks and lectures. I wanted her in every chapter of my life. 2 years later, we married in the small chapel on campus, surrounded by friends who cheered softly and professors who nodded like it was all part of some grand design. Back in our hometown, Eleanor and I built a modest house of our own wood frame and brick, with a broad front porch that caught the afternoon light and a backyard where Mom's old roses thrived. It wasn't just a dwelling. It was a testament to everything we believed in: craftsmanship, partnership, and a firm foundation. I poured my early career into designing shopping centers across Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, each project a way to bring people together, just as Eleanor had brought me into her world of letters and empathy. 2 years after our wedding, on a crisp October morning, Eleanor gave birth to our daughter Abigail. I remember the moment I first held that tiny being, her tuft of dark hair, her knotted fists, her perfect wrinkled face, and felt an uncontrollable surge of pride and protectiveness. We named her Abigail, meaning my father's joy, and never did a name ring more true. In the evenings, Eleanor read nursery rhymes while I built wooden blocks for Abigail to knock down. We taught her to walk in that same wide porch, where golden afternoon sun warmed her chubby little feet. Those days were a blend of lullabies and laughter, of measuring growth in inches and milestones. Life settled into a harmonious rhythm. I balanced blueprints and budgets. Eleanor balanced storybooks and tender care. And Abigail balanced her own budding curiosity with wide-eyed wonder at everything around her. Our home echoed with the patter of small footsteps, the rustle of pages turned, and the steady hum of community life just beyond our front gate. Neighbors waved as they passed. Church potlucks on Sundays filled the backyard with aromas of casseroles and pies. The old maple tree in our yard became Abigail's castle, her pirate ship, her throne. Sitting now in my rocker on that very porch, the wooden slats worn smooth by decades of seasons, I feel the same wind that once carried wheat into our fields. I can almost hear Ellen's soft voice humming as she tucked Abigail into bed, or Dad's laughter rising from the barn on crisp autumn mornings. Roots run deep in this place, roots of hard work, of love, of steadfast belief that family and home are the center of life's blueprint. And though the years have added gray to my hair and lines around my eyes, the promise we forged so long ago remains alive, to build something lasting, to nurture growth, and to cherish the simple poetry of every sunrise. The day Abigail first sat at the piano bench, her small fingers fanned across the keys like curious sparrows, I knew she was different. She was barely 5, but when she pressed that middle C and the sound unfurled through our living room, it was as if someone had painted the air with the color of her gift. Eleanor and I exchanged glances, pride, amazement, and a touch of awe that our daughter could channel something so pure and complex from such a tiny pair of hands. As she grew, music remained her heartbeat. Recitals at the local arts center, summer piano camps, the way she'd close her eyes and let every note tell a story we couldn't hear but could feel in our bones. School suited Abigail better than it suited most children. Algebraic formulas were puzzles she solved before many of her classmates had finished copying down the problem. Late nights, I'd sit at her desk, markers and textbooks strewn everywhere, helping her untangle calculus questions, while Eleanor hovered with a stack of novels, Bronte Steinbeck Morrison, to feed her daughter's appetite for words. When Abigail announced she wanted to major in marketing at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, it felt like the perfect intersection of her analytical mind and her creative spirit. Her scholarship audition was as natural as breathing. In front of a panel of stern professors and nervous applicants, Abigail stood tall in a simple navy dress, her recital piece printed neatly beside her notes on branding campaigns. She spoke of storytelling and advertising as though she'd been born to craft brand narratives, drawing parallels between Mozart's sonata form and the rising action of a product launch. The judges leaned in. Their polite smiles turned into genuine nods. By the time she finished, the room seemed to release a collective breath, and 2 weeks later, a letter arrived, offering her a full ride. College life in Omaha widened Abigail's world. I remember her first call home, breathless with excitement, a campus alive with late-night study groups, weekend concerts, and collaborative projects that felt more like playground experiments than homework. She met peers from every corner of the country, learned to debate the ethics of viral marketing campaigns, and organized pop-up advertising workshops for local nonprofits. Eleanor and I visited during Parents' Weekend, strolling the quad, where autumn leaves drifted past her feet like confetti. We met her friends, some destined for law school, others pursuing fine arts, and marveled at how she carried herself confident yet humble, generous, with her time curious about everyone's story. Graduation day blended sunlight and tears. Abigail crossed the stage in her crimson cap and gown, clutching a marketing degree with honors. I handed her a bouquet of daisies, her favorite for Eleanor to tuck behind her ear in an instant of playful mother-daughter intimacy, captured by countless phones and cameras. When the dean called her name, she turned and waved at us with a grin that radiated pure, unfiltered joy. As we hugged afterward, she whispered that she'd already accepted an offer from Weller & Black, the kind of advertising agency that churned out national campaigns for Fortune 500 companies. Her first weeks at Weller & Black were a whirlwind of brainstorming sessions, client dinners, and pitches delivered to skyscraper boardrooms. At home, we tracked her progress through her weekly calls. She'd recount a brainstorm gone brilliantly sideways, the thrill of watching a billboard with her tagline go live on the highway, the camaraderie of late-night strategy meetings fueled by pizza and iced coffee. Eleanor and I hung her first campaign poster in our kitchen, bold colors, a tagline about empowering small businesses, and admired how our little girl had grown into someone shaping messages seen by millions. Then came Matthew. He appeared in our lives on a crisp November afternoon, escorting Abigail to our front door with a shy smile and a bouquet of sunflowers. He was sharp-minded, too, an analyst who could recite quarterly projections as readily as he could quote lines from Tolstoy. Their chemistry was that unspoken rhythm you sense between two people who speak different dialects of the same language. Over dinner, they finished each other's sentences, laughed with ease, and debated the merits of print versus digital media without so much as raising an eyebrow at our astonishment. Their engagement announcement was subtle and perfect. Abigail handed me an envelope, cream paper, elegant calligraphy, inviting us to celebrate at a small bistro overlooking the Missouri River. Under string lights and a harvest moon, Matthew asked for Eleanor's blessing. First, gently taking her hand as though it were the most precious object in the world. Then he turned to me, knelt on one knee, and spoke words so earnest that I felt a warmth flood through every memory of her childhood. The first smile, the first recital, the first day of school, until all those moments shimmered in the firelight. Their wedding was everything we'd dreamed and more. An autumn ceremony in a rustic barn adorned with wildflowers, antique lanterns, and a string quartet that played Clair de Lune as Abigail walked down the aisle. Eleanor's eyes glistened as she watched her daughter glide forward, and I felt my own throat tighten when Abigail's gaze met mine, a silent message of gratitude for the roots we'd given her, and excitement for the branches she was about to grow. When they exchanged vows under the painted rafters promising partnership, adventure, and unwavering support, it felt like the culmination of every hope Eleanor and I had ever dared to entertain. In the glow of that harvest evening, as we danced under stars peeking through the barn's open doors, I realized that our daughter's promise had blossomed beyond even our most heartfelt dreams. Abigail was in every sense our living testament, proof that love nurtured with care, guided by knowledge, and set free to explore, could reach heights neither parent could have foreseen. And as the violin's final notes faded into laughter and clinking glasses, I knew that the brightest promise of all was not simply what Abigail had achieved, but the woman she had become and the woman she would continue to be. The first sign of change was the way Abigail answered the phone. Where once her voice bubbled with news of an exciting pitch or a new client, now she greeted me with a clipped, "Hello, Dad," followed by a quick rundown of her week's schedule. Her laughter felt rehearsed, and whenever I asked about her life with Matthew, she'd pause as if hunting for the right phrase. "It's busy," she'd say, then abruptly end the call. Eleanor noticed it before I did. One evening, as I poured us each a glass of iced tea on the back porch, she asked, "Do you think something's wrong?" I frowned, listening for a telltale sound of Abigail's presence in her tone, the spontaneous warmth that used to light up our conversations. But all I heard was exhaustion behind Abigail's sigh. "Work's hectic," I repeated, unconvinced, nipping at my tea as the cicadas droned in the twilight. Visits became precious and rare. The year after her wedding, Abigail and Matthew came home for Christmas, but only on Christmas Eve, and they stayed less than 24 hours. When they arrived, Matthew was on speakerphone, standing just inside our front door and droning through a quarterly projection with one of his analysts. He clicked through slides of rising interest rates and shifting market shares, while Abigail hovered beside him, nodding at every bullet point. It took me a moment to remember we were hosting a family holiday, not a fiscal review. I glanced at Eleanor, who tried to smile, setting out plates of roast turkey and mashed potatoes. She carved a slice and offered it to Abigail, but Abigail and Matthew retreated to the living room, leaving us to eat alone. I wanted to follow them to say, "Come on, this is your home," but the words died in my throat. Eleanor reached for my hand and squeezed it, her eyes apologizing for a daughter who seemed to vanish behind her husband's persona. Thanksgiving the following year was even quieter. Abigail called from her apartment in Omaha, her voice echoing down the line like she was speaking from a hallway, not a cozy dining room. She recited the usual lines, "Hope you're both well, enjoy the turkey, love you," and hung up. No anecdotes, no laughter. I sat by the window afterward, staring at the empty driveway, wishing I could dial her back and ask her to stay a little longer. But each unanswered call left a sting sharper than the last. As months turned into years, Matthew's influence grew more apparent. He joined every dinner via speakerphone for Abigail's birthdays, his voice calculating the cost of gifts and the return on investment for anniversary getaways. Once, when Abigail attempted to introduce Eleanor to Matthew's favorite author, he interrupted. "I don't have time for fiction," he said flatly. "I only read industry journals." Abigail flushed, then laughed nervously. I watched Eleanor's smile fade as if someone had switched off a lamp. One afternoon, I invited Abigail over to help me repair the old garden bench that Eleanor loved. I pictured us working side by side, exchanging gentle jokes as hammer met nail. Instead, she arrived with Matthew trailing behind, clutching a tablet and scheduling drills for an upcoming conference. She turned to me and said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I'd love to stay, but they need me at the office." She lingered for a minute, long enough to hug Eleanor in a way that felt distant, then slipped back into her car with Matthew, who was already reviewing his inbox before she turned the ignition. Eleanor tried to understand. Over tea that evening, she said, "Maybe he's just ambitious. He wants the best for her." I nodded, but my heart ached. I remembered Abigail's childhood when she spent weekends painting watercolor landscapes with her mother, her laughter bright as sunshine on the porch. Now she seemed to shrink beneath Matthew's shadow, her sparkle dimmed to a polite glimmer. I began to notice the small things: Abigail's apartment, as tidy and impersonal as a hotel room devoid of family photos, her wardrobe exchanging casual warmth for tailored suits, her voice adopting a measured tone as if each word were negotiable. Whenever I asked her what she truly wanted, what made her happy, she'd glance at Matthew's reflection in the window, searching for approval, and sigh. "I don't know, Dad. Everything's just busy." By the 5th year, Eleanor and I had come to dread the holidays. Invitations from Abigail arrived with qualifiers, if work permits. Subject to the client's schedule. I'll let you know. Our calendar stayed blank while everyone else's filled with gatherings and potlucks. We decorated the house for both Thanksgiving and Christmas anyway. Garlands of pine over the mantel, strings of lights framing the windows, a wreath on the door that Eleanor had woven by hand. Each evening we sat in the glow of our efforts, drinking tea in silence, hoping for a knock that never came. One December night I found Eleanor in our study, staring at a framed photo of the three of us parents on either side of a smiling Abigail in her graduation gown. A single candle flickered on the desk, casting long shadows across her face. "I wish she'd remember we're here," she whispered. I knelt beside her and took the photo, tracing Abigail's bright eyes with my finger. She remembers I lied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. In the quiet that followed, I realized that our daughter had been absorbed into a world defined by numbers and projections, a world where profit overshadowed presence. Yet I held on to hope, clinging to the memory of a little girl whose fingers coaxed music from ivory keys and whose laughter filled the corners of our home. Somewhere beneath the suit and the spreadsheet, that girl still existed. So I resolved to keep our doors open, our hearts wide, and our love unconditional. I'd write letters, long handwritten letters to Abigail, and place them in the mailbox, knowing she might never read them. I'd fill our home with reminders of the life we built together, family recipes handwritten in faded ink, her chubby handprints pressed into wet concrete in the garden path, the old piano Eleanor kept tuned just in case Abigail returned and wanted to play. Because despite the distance, despite the hush of unanswered calls and the cold precision of Matthew's world, we remained her parents. And sometimes I told myself as I lay awake on cold winter nights, love isn't loud. It's waiting patient as a seed beneath the snow until the ground thaws and the next season of possibility arrives. Everything shifted the day Eleanor received her diagnosis. I remember the doctor's words as if they were etched in my mind in a harsh, jagged script: pancreatic cancer. You have at best 12 months. The sterile room felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in while Eleanor squeezed my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes, those gentle wells of kindness, did not fill with fear, only a quiet resolve that spoke of years spent lifting others up. We told Abigail the same evening. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, Eleanor beside me, clutching my arm like a lifeline. Abigail's pause on the phone lasted longer than I expected. When she spoke, her voice trembled once, then steadied into that practiced calm. "I'll be there for Mum's birthday." She arrived 2 weeks later, bright-eyed but tight-lipped, clutching a bouquet of daisies, Eleanor's favorite. We celebrated in the hospital room with a tiny cake and whispered promises. And for a moment, I believed everything would be okay. In early spring, Eleanor took a sudden turn. Her pain intensified. The weight of day-to-day life pressed down on her frail frame. I called Abigail again, urging her to come home. She managed a second visit, just long enough to hold her mother's hand and slip away before the shadows grew long. After that, we saw her no more. Calls went unanswered, messages read but unreturned. Each time the phone slipped from my grasp, my heart sank a little further. Eleanor never spoke harshly of our daughter's absence. Instead, she turned to poetry. On warm afternoons we sat on the veranda, her blanket draped over my knees, and hers the worn wicker chairs creaking with each shift of weight. Bees flitted among the lavender bushes at the edge of the porch, and the breeze carried the scent of damp earth and budding flowers. Eleanor read to me then Keats's When I Have Fears. Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening poems whose words she knew by heart. Her voice was thin but steady, and each line hung between us in the afternoon light, an offering of beauty amid uncertainty. She'd pause between stanzas, gaze out over the fields we once roamed together and whisper, "Do you think we did something wrong, Martin?" It was the question that haunted me. I'd stroke her hair, still the soft brown she never dyed, and murmur, "No, my love, we did our best." But as I watched her eyes fill with unspoken sorrow, I knew she blamed herself, and perhaps in some corner of her mind blamed us both for our daughter's distance. Mornings began before dawn. I learned to cook in ways I never imagined: lean chicken broth simmered with carrots and celery pureed squash, scented with nutmeg, gentle rice porridge laced with ginger. Eleanor ate spoonfuls, then closed her eyes against the pain. I'd sit beside her, spoon in hand, waiting for her to swallow, tasting each breath of her struggle. Some days she managed a small smile. Others she simply whispered, "Thank you," and I felt gratitude and sorrow collide in my chest. Conversations grew sparse. The words that once came easily, discussing Abigail's latest achievements, sharing memories of our early years, vanished beneath the weight of her illness. Instead, we conveyed our love in silence, my hand on her arm, her head resting against my shoulder, the steady rhythm of two hearts refusing to quit. Often I'd catch her staring at the front door, as if willing our daughter to walk through it. The house felt too big, every creak of floorboard and hum of the refrigerator echoing Eleanor's absence. Friends and neighbors rallied. Mrs. Fenwick from next door brought casseroles and fresh flowers. Pastor Henry stopped by with prayers and quiet conversation. But when they left, the silence settled in again, as thick as the evening air. I'd imagine Abigail slipping past the ivy-clad gate, dropping her travel bag on the hall floor, rushing to Eleanor's side. I pictured her clearing her schedule, canceling clients, barreling down the highway with that determined glint in her eye. But those images remained dreams, ghosts of what might have been. One afternoon, as I wheeled Eleanor onto the porch in her wheelchair, the sky opened with rain. The drops pelted the wooden deck in staccato rhythms, and the lavender bent beneath the weight. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Reminds me of the nights we danced in the barn when I was young." I covered her knees with a blanket and settled beside her. We let the rain speak for us, its patter a lullaby that seemed to bridge years in a single moment. In early summer, Eleanor's strength waned dramatically. The nurses arrived twice daily. I learned to administer medications, to adjust her pillow for comfort, to read the signs when her breathing became shallow. One day she asked me to wheel her to the garden where the first roses of the season blushed pink along the trellis. She reached out her fingertips, gently grazing a petal. "They remind me of new beginnings," she whispered. I pressed her hand to mine and promised to keep her garden alive even after she was gone. As August edged toward autumn, Eleanor's time grew short. On mornings when the sun rose pale and soft, I carried her into the bedroom and helped her into our bed, where we once lay laughing on lazy Sundays. We spoke little. Instead, I read to her from her favorite anthology, Wolfe Eliot, Angelou, my voice low and calm, a beacon in her fading world. In those moments I felt every year of our life together stretch between us, a tapestry of love and loss, of hope and grief. One dawn, her breathing slowed to a whisper. I held her hand, felt its trembling cease, and cradled her as she slipped away. Outside the window, a cardinal sang his clear, bright song, perhaps a final benediction. I stayed with her, murmuring lines from her beloved poems until the first light of morning crept through the curtains. After the doctor left and the funeral home took her body, I sat alone in our bedroom, surrounded by her things: the straw hat she wore to the farmer's market, the stack of dog-eared poetry books on her nightstand, the soft shawl draped over her favorite chair. I closed my eyes and remembered her laughter, her gentle smile, the warmth of her hand in mine. That evening I wheeled her chair onto the veranda one last time and placed a single rose from the garden in her lap. The cicadas sang their evening chorus, and the sky flushed pink with sunset. I read her a final stanza from Whitman. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes, and felt her presence in every line. When darkness fell, I carried her indoors and tucked her books beneath her pillow. I whispered, "Good night, my love," and kissed her forehead even though her eyes were closed forever. The house felt impossibly vast without her gentle rhythms, her humming in the kitchen, her soft footsteps in the hallway, her voice reading poetry into the dusk. In the quiet that followed, I wondered where Abigail was and when she might come home. I pictured her reading these same lines on our porch, tears mingling with the summer breeze, her heart opening again to the family who had loved her first. And I resolved then and there that I would keep Eleanor's garden alive, her books by the bedside, her poems in my heart, until the day our daughter remembered the meaning of home. The morning of April 23rd broke with an almost sacred hush. The sky outside our bedroom window was a pale wash of pink and gray, and the first trill of a meadowlark drifted on the air as if to announce the new day. I sat beside Eleanor's bed, her frail hand still warm in mine, the ragged rise and fall of her chest growing ever more faint. I'd held her through the night, feeling the strength drain from her body, even as she whispered a half-remembered line of Frost's "The Road Not Taken." When her breathing finally stilled, the silence that followed was so complete it nearly deafened me. I lingered in that quiet, unable to fathom a world without Eleanor's soft voice reading poetry into the dusk, without her laughter drifting through the kitchen door, without the gentle press of her hand guiding mine. I leaned over and kissed her forehead, cool and smooth, knowing there would be no more mornings like this one. Outside, a lone cardinal flitted among the forsythia, its bright red plumage a fiery contrast to the gray dawn, and I took it as a small benediction, a promise that life would go on even when hers had ended. By the time I reached her favorite armchair in the corner, its cushions worn just where she liked to rest her elbow, I was trembling so hard I could barely thread my fingers through the rotary dial of the telephone. The wood of the chair was polished smooth by decades of shared conversation, and as I sank into it, I felt the weight of every year we'd spent side by side. My eyes filled with tears I could not hold back. I drew in a ragged breath and dialed Abigail's number. The line rang and rang, each tone echoing in my chest like a hammer striking a cold anvil, until at last I heard her voice, soft, sleepy, delivered with the same casual detachment she'd perfected over these recent years. "Hi, Dad," she said, as if I'd simply called to remind her about dinner plans. My throat closed and I fought to steady the quiver in my voice. Abigail. Mum's gone. She passed away about an hour ago. There was a long, strange pause. I imagined her sitting at her polished desk in Omaha, the city's distant hum barely audible through her apartment windows. Then, in that flat, half-asleep tone, she said, "Oh, just oh." No gasp, no stuttered question, no rush of concern or sorrow, only a single syllable that landed in my chest like a stone. I swallowed hard and pressed on. "Her service will be on Monday at St. Luke's Church at 11. My voice cracked. "Can you make it?" She paused again, and I could almost hear Matthew's voice in the background, a low murmur about coffee roasting schedules and next quarter forecasts. Then she said in a tone so calm I wondered if I'd misheard, "That's Monday." But that's the same day as Matthew's birthday. I felt the chair rock beneath me, as if I'd shifted, though I was too stunned to move. "Your husband's birthday," I repeated, trying to catch the meaning of her words. "Yeah," she said, drawing the word out as though it were a soft rhythm she was testing. "We already planned it? Invited people, booked the restaurant. Could we maybe push Mum's funeral to Tuesday? That'd be so much easier for us." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended by disbelief. I stared at the phone, willing her to finish, to say this was a terrible joke, to tell me she'd make time to show any flicker of the daughter I once knew. Instead, there was only the faint scrape of Matthew's chair against the floor. After what felt like an eternity, I found my voice. "No," I said softly, though the word rang loud in the silent room. "The funeral stays on Monday." She sighed as if this were a minor inconvenience. "Well," she said, "if you're going to be like that." "I get it, Dad. I'll try to come, but I can't promise." I closed my eyes against the swell of grief and anger that surged through me, part disbelief, part heartbreak. I thought of the tiny hospital room where Eleanor had clutched my hand and whispered her final fears of a daughter who'd drifted away, of all the mornings I had watched her look toward the door, waiting. I thought of every shared sunrise, every evening, reading poetry on the veranda, every quiet comfort and fierce joy of our life together. And I realized that in that single moment our daughter had made a choice that cut deeper than any loss I had ever known. "I understand," I said, though I did not. "Take care, Abigail." I hung up before she could reply. The chair seemed to cradle me as I sat there, the weight of Eleanor's absence pressing in from every corner. Outside, the meadowlark's song faded, replaced by the low hum of morning traffic drifting across the fields. My heart pounded not just from sorrow, but from the cold sting of betrayal, that the woman who had once raced across the porch to greet me, whose laughter had filled our home, now spoke of postponing her mother's farewell for a birthday cake. I rose slowly, palms pressed against the worn armrests, and walked to the window. The front yard was quiet dew sparkling on the grass in the soft dawn light. At the edge of the driveway, I could almost see Abigail's car parked, engine idling, ready to whisk her away from this small town and its inconvenient grief. I closed my eyes and let tears well up, falling freely down my cheeks. In the haze of tears, I remembered the vow I had made to Eleanor to keep her garden alive, to faithfully read her favorite poems, to cherish her presence in every corner of this home. But for whom, I wondered, and the answer cut through me like winter's frost for us, for her memory, and for the family she believed in, whether Abigail chose to honor it or not. I walked from the window and gathered Eleanor's shawl from the back of her chair, draping it around my shoulders as though it were her embrace once more. I placed a gentle kiss on her pillow and whispered, "Rest well, my love. I will carry on for you." In the stillness, I heard Eleanor's favorite line from Keats drifting through my mind. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. That beauty was her life, and now it was my task to honor it with or without Abigail at my side. I left the bedroom and moved through the house in a quiet procession, lighting candles by Eleanor's photos, setting out her poetry books on the living room table, opening her window to let in the fresh April air. Each small ritual felt like a promise that her voice would still echo here, her hands still shape the warmth of the hearth, her spirit still guide the life she had built. When the phone rang again, I ignored it. The world outside would wait. In this moment, I needed the silence, the solitude, the weight of loss to ground me. I took Eleanor's shawl in both hands and held it close, feeling its softness, remembering every moment we had shared. Monday at 11, I would stand at St. Luke's Church and speak to the empty pew where my daughter ought to have sat. I would speak to the friends, neighbors, and family who came in her place. And I would listen for the echo of her laughter in the vault of stone and glass, hoping against hope that somewhere in the quiet she might hear it too and know what she had left behind. I sat in the study long after the funeral home vanished down the driveway, my gaze fixed on the family portrait above the mantel. In that faded photograph, Eleanor stood between me and a 10-year-old Abigail, her hands resting lightly on our shoulders, as if to bind us together forever. The afternoon sun slanted through the bay window, illuminating her bright smile. And in that light my grief crystallized into something colder, more determined. The funeral would be Monday at 11 sharp. If Abigail chose not to come, I would proceed without her blessing, and so be it. 3 days later, I found myself in Philip Kramer's oak-paneled office. Philip had known our family since my first real estate venture, had watched Eleanor and me through promotions, children's graduations, and retirement plans. Now he looked at me with cautious concern. "Martin, are you certain?" he asked, chin resting on steepled fingers. I drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of Eleanor's absence in every corner of the room. "Yes," I said quietly. "I want to remove Abigail from my will. She will inherit nothing. Instead, half of my estate goes to the Children's Reading Foundation. Eleanor founded a quarter to the animal shelter she adored, and the remainder to the cancer research fund that might have given her more time." Philip's pen hovered over his legal pad. He glanced down at the form of my original will, handwritten notes, scribbled amendments, decades of revisions that had once expressed my love for family. Now those notes had to be erased. "You understand, she can contest this," he said. "She could file suit claim, undue influence, or diminished capacity." I met his gaze without flinching. "I am of sound mind. This is my last act of fairness. A daughter who chooses a birthday cake over her mother's funeral forfeits her claim." My words felt harsh in the quiet room, but they rang true in my ears. Philip nodded, scribbling notes. He asked the usual questions. My current assets, the safe deposit box where the trust papers would be stored, the witnesses he would call to verify my capacity. I answered each one pragmatically, my savings, the equity in the house, the stock portfolio, and felt a strange relief in the exactitude of it all. Numbers and names, distributions spelled out in crisp legal language. After an hour of adjustments, adding clauses to prevent later challenges, specifying that the charities must receive their portions upon my death, forbidding Abigail from any benefit unless a judge decreed otherwise, Philip pushed the final draft across his desk. "We'll need your signature and 2 witnesses. I can arrange for Dr. Reed from the clinic to administer a brief evaluation," he said. "That way, if Abigail tries to argue you weren't competent, we have proof." I stood smoothing my jacket. Thank you, Philip. Arrange everything. I want this done properly. Back home, I placed the draft will on Eleanor's desk alongside her poetry books and her favorite pen. I sat in her chair, the leather worn soft by decades of her presence, and stared at the documents. I thought of Abigail as a little girl chasing fireflies on warm summer nights, her laughter dancing among the lantern light. I thought of the shy teenager she grew into her hair in a braid as she paused on the porch to kiss me good night. And I thought of the woman whose voice had sounded so indifferent on the phone, abrupt, rehearsed, more concerned about a birthday party than a mother's goodbye. A wave of guilt washed over me. Was this too severe? Should I have built a bridge instead of burning one? But then I recalled Eleanor's last words, "You must protect what matters." She had always believed in fairness, in standing up for what is right, and for her family meant more than blood. It meant loyalty, sacrifice, the willingness to stand when it's hardest. That evening I gathered Eleanor's circle of friends, Mrs. Fenwick, Pastor Henry, my brother Henry, and asked them to serve as witnesses. They arrived, candles flickering on the coffee table, and one by one they watched me sign and date the will, each of them attesting that I seemed clear-eyed and composed. I handed them photocopies for their records and tucked the original into the fireproof safe next to Eleanor's wedding ring and the letter she'd written to Abigail during her final days. The day's dusk settled into deep blue, and I found myself back in that armchair, the family portrait glowing softly in the lamplight. I sipped a glass of Eleanor's favorite Cabernet, the rich, bittersweet flavor reminding me of both celebration and sorrow. And I raised the glass in a silent toast to Eleanor, whose love of books and children would outlast us both, to the charities that would carry her legacy forward, and I realized to my own resolve to honor her memory even at the cost of my only child's inheritance. At midnight I went to our bedroom and retrieved Eleanor's shawl from the chair where I always left it. It was woven of the softest wool, dyed the deep purple she'd chosen, because it reminded her of twilight's quiet beauty. I draped it over my shoulders like a mantle, feeling its familiar warmth, as though she still sat beside me, humming her favorite lines from Tennyson. I whispered, "I've done what you'd want, my love," and pressed it close to my heart. In the following week, I walked through the house, making small preparations for the days ahead. I arranged for flowers from Eleanor's garden to adorn her chair at Sunday's memorial service. I updated her poetry readings on the church program, Frost Keats Angelou, so that each guest would hear the verses she loved. I found her favorite teacup in the china cabinet, set it on the serving table with a fresh pot of Earl Grey, and imagined her standing by the window catching raindrops on her fingertips. Yet amid these practical tasks, my thoughts kept returning to Abigail. I wondered if she would receive word of the new will, how she would react when she learned her inheritance had been redirected. Would she understand eventually why I felt compelled to act? Would she mourn her mother's death with the same depth of feeling we had shared? Or would she deem it another inconvenience in her busy life? I resolved to keep the news until the appropriate time, no hasty calls, no last-minute announcements. The lawyer would notify her within 30 days of my passing as the law required. And until that day came, I would continue my daily rituals, morning tea on the veranda, reading poetry beside the roses, tending the small vegetable patch Eleanor had planted. In doing so, I kept her spirit alive, sustained her legacy, and held fast to the principles she had taught me. In the days leading up to the funeral, neighbors offered condolences, shared memories, and asked if there was anything they could do. I thanked them, invited a few to read at the service, and encouraged everyone to speak of Eleanor's kindness. But I kept the details of the will close to my chest. This was a private reckoning, a silent testament to my love for her and to the standard I believed a family must uphold. On Monday morning, I rose before dawn as usual. I donned the black suit I had chosen for the funeral, the one with the midnight blue tie Eleanor had picked out last Christmas. In the mirror, I saw an older man, hair now salt and pepper lines etched around my eyes like topographical maps of memory. I straightened my collar, placed the shawl over my arm, her shawl, and took the photograph from the mantel, hugging it to my chest for a moment. Eleanor, Abigail, and me, smiling in the golden light of a long-ago afternoon. I placed the photo in my breast pocket closest to my heart. As I walked out onto the porch, the air was crisp, and a single cardinal rested on the fence, bright as a blossom, against the gray sky. I paused, watching its head tilt with curiosity, and sensed Eleanor's presence in that flash of red. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I stepped off the threshold into the world without her carrying with me her garden's blossoms, her poem's echoes, and the unshakable knowledge that some choices must be made with both sorrow and resolve. I would face the church pews, the hush of mourning, the hush of absence. I would feel the eyes of friends, of parishioners, of family, everyone except the one who should have been there. And in that solemn moment, I would hold fast to my decision, knowing that I honored Eleanor's life more faithfully than any inheritance could express. For in the end, it is not wealth that defines a legacy, but the principles we stand for, even when the cost is heartbreak. The morning after the funeral, I woke to a house that felt too full of emptiness. The memory of yesterday's service lingered in every corner like the echo of a distant bell. Clouds hung low over the fields, their gray faces mirroring the sorrow pressing down on my chest. I dressed in the same charcoal suit I'd worn at St. Luke's, still crisp, still stained with the faintest dust of flower petals, and descended the front stairs to find dishes lined up on the porch. Neighbors had arrived with casseroles, green bean gratin in a Pyrex dish, cheesy scalloped potatoes in a foil tray, a hearty beef stew that smelled of thyme and black pepper. Mrs. Fenwick hovered in a corner, her eyes red but determined, arranging platters on folding tables borrowed from the church. Pastor Henry stood by her side, giving gentle instructions. "A little more space here for the drinks," he said, guiding plastic cups into neat rows. I offered a tired smile and helped clear room on the bench for extra plates. By mid-morning, the porch buzzed with quiet conversation. Folks whom Eleanor had tutored in reading filled the benches, their faces lined with grief and gratitude. Someone handed me a spoonful of sweet potato casserole, and I nodded in thanks, my appetite gone by the second bite. Over by the mailbox, my brother Henry leaned against the fence, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a charcoal overcoat. He caught my eye and gave me a curt nod. Henry's plane had landed late the night before. He'd driven straight to the house round the clock from St. Louis because he said a brother must be there in times like these. Inside church, friends labored over the wake preparations, spreading white tablecloths, arranging framed photos of Eleanor. Her radiant smile at our wedding, her gentle glance as she read to local school children, her arms outstretched beneath a cascade of autumn leaves. I paused before one photo, the image of her standing by the rose garden in spring, wearing a straw hat and holding a watering can. The roses behind her bloomed in shades of pink and ivory, her favorite palette. I reached out, caressed the glass, and felt a tear slip down my cheek. All day, people trickled in to pay their respects, former colleagues from the engineering firm where I'd worked, friends from Eleanor's book club, parents whose children had learned to read because she volunteered in their schools. They spoke of her kindness, how she would memorize a shy child's name, how she never judged even the slowest learner, how she made everyone feel seen. Their voices pooled in the living room like a warm current, reminding me of the good ripples one life could leave behind. But amid that outpouring of compassion, one seat remained conspicuously empty. Every time I looked up toward the front door, hoping to see Abigail's familiar blonde hair shining in the afternoon light, I was met with silence. I wanted to believe she would burst through with a breathless apology, her cheeks flushed with regret. Instead, I saw only the heavy oak door shut firmly against the world. As dusk deepened, Pastor Henry led a brief evening devotional in the living room. He read from Corinthians, spoke of hope rising in the darkest hour, spoke of resurrection and renewal. His words were gentle, unwavering. When he finished, he placed a comforting hand on my shoulder and said, "Martin, she'll come when she's ready." I managed a nod, but inside I felt the hollow ache of a father's longing. After everyone left, after the casseroles, the plastic cups, the soft goodbyes, Henry and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. He stood by the sink, idly rinsing a bowl, his broad frame still tense. "She's not coming," I said softly. Henry's shoulders slumped. He set the bowl down and turned to me. "None of us can force her," he replied. His voice was flat, but his eyes betrayed sorrow. "I'm sorry, Marty." I rubbed my forehead. "I know." I thought of how Abigail's voice had sounded on the phone, how her words had clipped the air like a guillotine. I can't believe she'd choose a birthday cake over her mother's eulogy." Henry nodded. "Matthew's influence is strong," he said. "But remember, she's your daughter." His words felt like a lifeline. I clung to them, even as the waters of despair threatened to pull me under. That night, Henry insisted I stay in his guest room, but I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the darkened hallways, each room a shrine to memories: Eleanor's knitting basket by the hearth, her tea kettle on the stove, her reading glasses on the bedside table next to the poetry she'd never finish. I lifted her glasses gently, the lenses smudged with yesterday's tears. I held them to the dim lamp and felt the ache of absence squeeze my heart. In the living room, I found the armchair where she used to read, now empty, the shawl draped over its back. I sat down, clutching the shawl to my chest, breathing in the faint scent of lavender and old paper. The house creaked around me, the floorboards settling as if in mourning. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the silence swallow me. It was in that silence that her absence felt most profound, not the hollow of her voice or the emptiness of her chair, but the knowledge that our daughter had chosen to stay away. Sleep finally came in fits and starts. I dreamed of Abigail as a child running across the fields with daisies woven into her hair, her laughter skipping ahead of her like sunlight on water. I woke at dawn with tears on my pillow and a sense of irrevocable loss. The following morning, word spread that a special memorial would be held at the Reading Foundation where Eleanor had worked. A handful of volunteers asked if I could join them for a short ceremony at the Literacy Center just across town. Standing beneath the vaulted ceiling of that old brick building surrounded by books stacked floor to ceiling, I felt a connection to Eleanor's life work that transcended our grief. One by one, volunteers spoke of how she had taught them to see the magic in letters, how she had changed lives with patient kindness. Elderly men who once struggled with basic reading skills held up books Eleanor had given them. Children recited alphabet rhymes she'd taught. Their voices carried through the hall, weaving a tapestry of gratitude and remembrance that felt like sunlight piercing through a storm. I closed my eyes against a rush of emotion and whispered, "Thank you, my love." In that moment, I understood that Eleanor's legacy lived in every spoken word, every child who learned to read, every heart she had touched. And if Abigail could not partake in this community of remembrance, she would still be bound to her mother's gifts, even if only by memory. Back at home, I found a stack of cards and letters left on the kitchen counter. One was from Agnes Thompson, the librarian at the elementary school. She was a beacon, the note read. Another from a local shelter worker. She had a special way with the lost and the lonely. I set these letters aside and drafted my own for Abigail, gentle lines telling of the community's love of the books gifted, of the smiles restored. I left it on the counter unsigned for now, hoping she might tear open the envelope when the weight of her own conscience drew her home. In the days that followed, I kept up the routine morning tea on the porch, tending Eleanor's roses, reading a poem softly into the breeze. Henry helped me repair the fence. We cleared the vegetable patch for fall planting. We laughed over old family stories in the evenings. Yet every fold of the shawl over my knees, every page turned in her poetry books. Every rose that bloomed under my care whispered her absence and whispered that of her granddaughter and that of her daughter. Each night I lit a single candle by Eleanor's photograph. The flickering flame threw dancing shadows against the wall as if to remind me that even in darkness, light persists. I whispered, "The lines she once loved. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul," and imagined Abigail hearing them in the hush of her own home, her heart stirring at the memory of the mother she had lost. And though the pain of her absence cut deeper than any wound I'd known, I clung to the promise that time might soften the edges of her regret. For in the tapestry of community, in the embrace of friends and neighbors, in the blooming of roses and the turning of pages, Eleanor's spirit endured. And perhaps in that enduring presence, our daughter would one day find her way back to the family that still waited, its arms open in grief, its hearts ready to forgive. The morning sun had barely warmed the dew on Eleanor's rose petals when I first saw Abigail's sedan gliding up the gravel drive. It was a sleek, dark car, modern, efficient, the sort of vehicle her husband might have chosen for its resale value. I was bent over the flower bed, my hands in the cool earth coaxing new shoots to life beneath the trellis. When I straightened and looked up, I saw her pause at the edge of the walkway as if deciding whether this was the right moment to cross the threshold into a home that had felt empty without her. My heart thudded with equal parts hope and caution. The past 6 weeks had been a blur of condolence calls, community memorials, and the persistent echo of Abigail's absence. I had planted new rose bushes in Eleanor's honor, each one a silent prayer that our daughter might return. Could this be the moment she'd finally come home? She came toward me slowly, her high heels clicking on stone. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, cut in a precise bob, framing a face that looked both older and unsettled. When she reached me, she hesitated, a breath away from the flowers, then inhaled sharply and said, "Dad." I straightened, wiping my hands on my trousers. Her voice sounded fragile, as if she were trying to steady herself. "Hello, Abigail," I said, setting aside the trowel. The roses nodded gently in the breeze, as if offering their own welcome. She managed a half-smile and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She shook her head as though the words were too heavy to carry. "I should have been here. I know that now." I studied her expression, the tension in her jaw, the tremor in her hands. She looked nothing like the carefree child who had polka-dot dresses and sticky fingers. She was a woman weighed down by remorse. "Come inside," I said, motioning toward the kitchen door. The house smelled of fresh coffee and the lingering sweetness of baking bread. I had asked Mrs. Fenwick to prepare a pot for this morning, hoping it would help bridge the distance that had grown between us. We settled at the old oak table by the window, its surface worn smooth by generations of shared meals and conversations. Abigail cradled her mug, her knuckles pale against the porcelain. She glanced at the bouquet of daisies I had placed in water on the table, her mother's favorite, and exhaled. "I know I can't undo the past," she began. "I regret not being here for Mom. I regret letting Matthew's schedule and priorities come before my own family." Her voice cracked, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. "Dad, I'm so sorry." I nodded, watching the steam rise from her coffee. "Your apology means something," I said softly, "but it doesn't fill the empty seat at the funeral. And it doesn't erase the months your mother spent alone, the days I held her hand without you here." I chose my words carefully. Anger and pain still throbbed beneath the surface. "Why did you stay away?" She closed her eyes as if gathering the courage to answer. "It wasn't just me, Dad. Matthew's career shifted. He got a new partnership, a promotion. It meant more travel, more meetings he couldn't miss. I thought I could juggle both worlds, my job, his demands, our home life. But I lost sight of what mattered most. I see that now." I listened as she traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "You lost sight of who you are," I said, "and you lost sight of where you came from." My voice was steadier than I expected, but the ache in my chest made my throat raw. "It isn't just a mother's funeral you skipped. It's a symbol of the values she taught you. Loyalty, sacrifice, family. You minimized all of that for the sake of convenience." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at me with pleading. "I want to make it right." She reached across the table but withdrew her hand when I did not move. "Tell me what to do." I studied her. This was the moment of truth. Would she merely perform apologies, or would she choose a path that demonstrated her understanding? I thought of Eleanor teaching Abigail to read, to slow down, to find empathy in every word, and realized that half measures would not suffice. "Abigail," I said, voice low but firm, "you need to divorce Matthew." She recoiled as if I had struck her. Coffee sloshed in the mug, dripping onto the table. "What?" she gasped, her cheeks flushing. "Divorce, Dad, you can't be serious." That's the standard you must meet," I interrupted, trying to keep my tone even. "Matthew taught you to chase profit and career above all else. He's the one who convinced you that your mother's life was an inconvenience and your family, your own father, was secondary. If you truly want to honor your mother's memory and reclaim who you once were, you must relinquish those values he instilled." Her breath caught, and she sank back into her chair, eyes wide. "You can't expect me to give up my marriage for this," she said, voice quivering. "I love him, or I thought I did. He's my partner." I leaned forward. "Would a true partner have stood aside when your mother lay dying? Would he have scheduled his birthday party when she took her last breath? A good man, a good husband, lets his wife say goodbye to her mother." My heart pounded, words flaring like hot coals. "If you stay married to him, you choose his values over your mother's legacy and over your own." Tears streamed down her face now. She reached for her cup again, gripping it as if it might anchor her torn emotions. "Divorce him," she whispered. "Break his heart. Destroy our life. That's not fair." "It's not supposed to be easy," I said. "It's supposed to be the hardest thing you've ever done because it tests what you really believe. Do you believe in family more than in convenience? In loyalty more than in profit? In love more than in comfort?" She closed her eyes, and I watched the conflict ripple across her features. the tightness in her forehead, the catch in her breath. I remembered how she cooed over dolls, how she ran through our yard with daisies in her hair, how she curled into Eleanor's lap for story time. I longed to see that daughter again, not this woman ensnared by ambition's cold logic. She sat in silence for the longest time, the weight of my words pressing down like the midsummer sun. Finally she looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "I don't know if I can," she said shakily. "I don't know who I'd be without him." "Then you're right," I replied, voice breaking. "Until you choose to change, you are not my daughter." The room felt impossibly still after I spoke. Outside, the roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the afternoon light like stained glass. Abigail wrapped her arms around herself, tears falling onto the tablecloth. I stood my chair, scraping the floor, and walked to the window, my back to her. "In the name of the mother you profess to honor," I said, quietly, "choose wisely." I ran my fingers along the windowsill, tracing the knots in the wood. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by Abigail's soft sobs and the distant hum of traffic on the country road. I did not turn to see her face. I did not know if she would stand firm or run from the house. All I knew was that Eleanor's values, those quiet truths she taught us on the veranda among the lavender and the pages of poetry, deserved more than a fleeting apology. They deserved a testament of action. And so I waited, gazing at the roses she once tended, waiting for the one person whose choice would determine whether our family could someday be whole again. The first snow fell the week before Christmas, drifting down in lazy spirals that coated our driveway in a quiet hush. I was in the kitchen brewing a pot of coffee when the phone rang. I recognized Abigail's number and answered before the third ring. "Dad," she said, voice bright with something I hadn't heard in years. Relief. "I've filed the papers." My heart caught. "You did?" I asked, setting down the spoon I'd been stirring with. She laughed, a clear, unguarded sound. "Yes. I left half of what we had behind," she said. "The house, the car, you name it. I'm starting over." Her tone carried pride and fear in equal measure, a mixture I knew well from Eleanor's own early days of change. "I'm moving into a small place in Benson. Not glamorous, but cozy." Tears pricked my eyes as I pictured her in a modest apartment rather than the polished condominium she once called home. "I'm proud of you, Abigail," I said, my voice thick. "I know it wasn't easy." She paused, then said, "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I couldn't keep living a lie." Her honesty cut through the distance between us, replacing months of hurt with hope. "Thank you for giving me that choice, Dad. I wouldn't have seen it otherwise." Over the next few days, she described her new routine, the clatter of coffee cups in the corner cafe where she now worked as an account coordinator, the hum of the office printer, the soft glow of street lamps on her walk home each evening. She spoke of the modest apartment's squeaky radiator and the thrift store furniture she'd bought: an old wooden desk, a mismatched set of chairs, a single bookshelf where she kept Eleanor's poetry collection, and a few favorite novels. She told me about her lunch breaks feeding stray cats in the alley behind the office, how she learned to stretch $1 at the neighborhood grocery store, how she finally felt the lightness of living within her means. Each week she called without prompting, no pleas for money, no excuses for absence. Instead, she shared laughter about her boss's bad jokes, about the day she accidentally wore 2 different shoes to work, about a small client's delight at her first ad mock-up. Her voice brimmed with genuine enthusiasm, the kind that comes from waking each morning without the weight of pretense or the pressure of lofty expectations. In January, on a day when the sky was the color of pewter and the wind carried the tang of melting ice, I drove to the cemetery to lay new tulips on Eleanor's grave. When I arrived, I found Abigail already there, kneeling in the snow beside the headstone, her cheeks streaked with tears. She held a bunch of pale pink tulips, Eleanor's favorite flower, wrapped in plain brown paper, the petals dusted with snowflakes. "Dad," she said, glancing up through tears and offering me the flowers. They trembled in her hand, fragile as her newfound vulnerability. I helped her arrange them in the vase embedded in the granite, and she rested her forehead against the cold stone, weeping quietly. I stood beside her in silence, the winter air sharp against our faces. After a long moment, she turned to me and whispered, "I thought about all the times I missed here, the days I chose comfort over connection. I'm sorry, Dad." Her voice trembled with sincerity, and I saw in her expression the transformation I had hoped for a daughter, truly connected to her roots, humbled by loss, and ready to build anew. We lingered until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of lavender and gold. When we finally rose, Abigail smiled through her tears. "Let's go get coffee," she suggested. My treat. Inside the little cafe by the cemetery gates, we sat at a corner table beside the window. Steam curled from our mugs as we recounted memories of Eleanor, her favorite novels, her infectious laugh when she discovered a new poem, her penchant for humming in the kitchen as she baked. Abigail laughed softly at a story about her mother's disastrous attempt to fix the television antenna back in the 80s, and I realized I'd never heard my daughter laugh with such ease. Over the next weeks, I watched her unfold in ways both subtle and profound. She took on extra shifts at the cafe, volunteered at the Children's Reading Foundation in the afternoons, and joined a community book club where she rediscovered her mother's love of literature. She told me about the small apartment's creaky floorboards, the thrift store quilt she used to stave off winter chill, the empty walls now cluttered with postcards and faded family photos. She described an evening when she sat alone with a cup of tea reading Octavia's poetry, and feeling her presence in every line as though her mother's spirit were guiding her through grief and growth. One Sunday morning, I received a call from Mrs. Fenwick. "Your daughter's here," she said simply. "She brought freshly baked scones from your recipe." When I arrived, Abigail was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, laughter filling the space as she showed the neighbor how to fold pastry. Her eyes shone with the same warmth I remembered from those long-ago story hours on the porch. She handed me a scone still warm from the oven and slipped her arm through mine. "This is home, Dad," she said. "Thank you for letting me find my way back." In February, I received a letter from her, no longer typed on stationery from Weller and Black, but scrawled in blue ink on a dog-eared postcard from an art fair. She wrote of her new boyfriend, a school teacher who volunteered at the reading center and shared her mother's passion for children's stories. She told me about the first spring bulbs pushing through the thawing ground beneath the rose garden, about her plans to plant a new bed of tulips in Eleanor's memory. Her words were bright with possibility, each line a testament to the woman she was becoming. As winter gave way to early spring, I walked the garden paths we'd tended together. The roses, now budding, promised blooms in shades of pink that would honor Eleanor's spirit. I placed a packet of tulip bulbs by the fence, knowing Abigail would join me soon to plant them, an act of renewal we would share. And when she arrived, shovel in hand and laughter in her eyes, I felt our family's circle close, not with a perfect return to the past, but with a hard-earned transformation toward empathy, humility, and a love unburdened by pretense. In those moments, hands in the soil, hearts open to one another, I understood that true inheritance is not measured in assets or titles, but in the values that endure through change. Abigail had paid the price for her choices not in bitterness, but in growth. She had found the courage to redefine herself, to honor her mother's memory, and to reconnect with her own sense of worth. And as we planted the tulip bulbs together, the soil soft beneath our feet, I knew that the garden where Eleanor's roses would soon bloom again would stand as a living testament to love's capacity to heal, even when it requires us to start over. The first warm day in February brought new life to the garden. I stepped outside just before dawn and paused on the porch, watching tiny green shoots unfurl at the base of the rose bushes, that same rose bush Eleanor had planted the spring before she fell ill. A pair of cardinals flitted among the branches, their bright feathers a promise that the bleakness of winter was ending. I inhaled the cool morning air and felt something shift inside me, a sense that renewal was possible not just for the garden, but for my family. I carried that feeling back into the house and dialed Philip Kramer's office. His familiar voice greeted me over the line. "Martin, how are you holding up?" I cleared my throat. "As well as can be expected," I said. "But I've been thinking. It's time to rewrite my will." There was a pause. "Do you want to restore Abigail as your heir?" he asked gently. "Yes," I replied, "but with a stipulation: her inheritance should come as a gift she's earned through her own transformation, not as an entitlement she takes for granted. I want half to remain designated for Eleanor's Children's Reading Foundation and the animal shelter and cancer fund we chose together. The other half should go to Abigail to recognize her growth." Philip made notes. "We'll prepare a new draft," he said. "I'll include language that specifies the conditions under which she receives it, demonstration of continued community work, volunteering, or other measures of her renewed commitment to family and service." "That sounds right," I said, picturing Abigail kneeling by her mother's grave, tulips in hand, weeping genuine tears, proof of her change. 2 days later, I met Philip in his office again. The oak-paneled walls felt less oppressive this time. He slid the draft across the desk. "Half the estate will go to the 3 charities, split equally," he explained. "The remaining half is bequeathed to Abigail contingent upon her continued charitable involvement and a letter acknowledging her understanding of family values. I've also added a clause: if she fails to maintain those commitments, the funds revert to the Reading Foundation." I read through the language carefully. It was precise, almost clinical, but it captured the essence of what I wanted: that Abigail's inheritance be a testament to her own actions, not a birthright. I nodded. "This honors Eleanor's legacy and recognizes Abigail's journey," I said. "Let's schedule the signing next week with the same witnesses as before." Philip smiled. "I'll coordinate with Mrs. Fenwick and Pastor Henry. Dr. Reed will conduct a brief capacity evaluation beforehand. That way there's no question of your sound mind." As I left the office, the late afternoon sun glinted off the snowbanks along the street. I felt a lightness I hadn't known since Eleanor's funeral, an anticipation of setting things right. That Saturday, I walked through the garden with Henry, my brother, who'd come up from Missouri again. We pruned dead branches, cleared away fallen leaves, and admired the velvety green of daffodil shoots poking through the soil. Henry hummed a tune Eleanor used to sing, and I realized that my home was stirring back to life just as my heart was beginning to heal. When Abigail called that afternoon, her voice carried a hopeful note. "Dad, I'm heading home tomorrow," she said. "I'd like to really talk about everything." I agreed, and we made plans for her arrival early the next day. On Sunday morning, the sky was a crystalline blue. I had just finished a pot of coffee when I heard the gravel crunch under tires. Stepping onto the porch, I saw Abigail climbing out of her sedan, her cheeks flushed with cold and nerves. She carried a small paper bag and the bright scarf I'd knitted for her last Christmas, still fragrant with lavender. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but clear. She paused, then smiled tentatively. "Thank you for letting me come." I set down my mug and came to meet her at the steps. She slipped off her scarf and wrapped me in a hug, arms tight around my waist. I felt her heart pounding against my chest. "I've missed this," she whispered. Inside, I put the kettle on while she shook off snow from her boots. We sat at the kitchen table, the bouquet of spring tulips I'd arranged in a crystal vase catching the sunlight. Her pale pink petals seemed to glow against the window's frost edge. "I wanted to show you something," Abigail said, pulling the paper bag toward her. She reached inside and lifted out an envelope, thick, cream-colored, embossed with my initials. My gaze flicked to her hands, which shook slightly as she set the letter before me. I wrote this because I had to understand what I was giving up and what I was getting in return. I placed a hand over hers. "I'll read it later," I said. "But first, I have news of my own." I folded back the draft of the new will and set it between us. I met with Philip. I've rewritten my will. Half the estate remains dedicated to Eleanor's charities. The other half is for you, Abigail, as a gift you've earned, not as a right. She gasped, her eyes wide. "Dad!" She reached out and touched the document. Her fingers trembled. A moment later, tears spilled down her cheeks. She covered her face and sank to her knees beside the table. "Thank you," she sobbed. "I don't deserve this. I promise I will honor her memory for the rest of my life." I knelt beside her and wrapped my arms around her. "You've already honored her," I whispered, "by coming home, by choosing the hard road. This is simply the last step." She paused, looking up into my eyes. "I will never take this for granted," she vowed. "I'll keep volunteering at the Reading Foundation. I'll continue helping at the animal shelter. And I'll support cancer research in her name." I helped her to her feet and hugged her again. "Welcome home, Abigail." That afternoon, we walked through the rose garden together, the air fragrant with early blossoms. Abigail knelt by the soil and planted a new tulip bulb next to her mother's roses, her hand steady, her expression focused. I stood beside her, silently grateful to see her nurture life as Eleanor once did. By evening, we sat on the veranda with mugs of tea, the garden fading into twilight around us. Abigail read aloud from one of Eleanor's favorite poems, her voice strong and sure. The words flowed like a melody, echoing the lessons of loyalty, sacrifice, and love Eleanor had taught us both. As darkness settled, we lit a lantern and placed it on the porch railing. Its soft glow warmed the gathering chill, a symbol of family rekindled. I listened to Abigail's voice, guiding me through each line of the poem, and I felt the healing I'd longed for stretch between us, an unbroken thread woven of loss, forgiveness, and renewed hope. In that moment, as we sat side by side beneath the stars, I knew our family circle was closing once more, not with a perfect return to what had been, but with a hard-earned unity of hearts transformed. And as the lantern flickered in the growing night, I realized that the true legacy of Eleanor's love would live on not in cold statutes or distant memories, but in the warm pulse of a family forgiven and made whole again. I remember the morning Abigail called to say she wanted me to meet someone new. It was still cool enough to need a light jacket, but the sun sparkled off the thawing pavement like a promise. We agreed to meet at the Children's Reading Foundation, where Eleanor had spent so many afternoons teaching young minds to love books. As I walked through the double doors, the familiar scent of paper and crayons greeted me. The scent of possibility. Abigail was waiting by the old oak table in the foundation's cozy lounge, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, a smile that seemed to lift the corners of her eyes in a way I hadn't seen since before her marriage. Beside her stood a man I'd never met. David, she said, a middle school teacher who volunteered here every week. He was placing a stack of picture books on the low shelf that Eleanor used to organize his movements, gentle and deliberate, as if he were arranging more than just paper and ink. "Dad," Abigail said, stepping forward. She reached out to squeeze my hand, then turned toward David. "This is the man I told you about, David Harper." David extended his hand with a warm, steady grip. His eyes, kind and curious, met mine directly. "Mr. Blake," he said quietly, "it's a pleasure to meet you." His voice had the soft resonance of someone accustomed to calming a classroom of restless teenagers. We settled into mismatched chairs around the table, mugs of coffee before us. Abigail poured for us, glancing between David and me with a look that mixed excitement and a hint of nerves. I watched them both as I sipped my coffee, the same robust blend Eleanor favored, and felt a sense of calm wash over me. David spoke first, his gaze turning toward the bright murals on the walls, scenes of forests, animals, children reading beneath a rainbowed sky. "I started volunteering here 2 years ago," he said. "It was my wife's idea." He paused briefly, a flicker of older grief passing across his face. "She died in an accident, and I wanted to remain connected to her love of literature. That brought me here to this place Eleanor built." My heart tightened at the mention of another loss. I nodded, understanding too well the ache of an empty chair. "Your wife shared Eleanor's passion." Then I said, "Eleanor believed in reading as a way to build community." David smiled gently. "She did. And when I met Abigail, I saw the same spark in her. I saw how books shaped her childhood. I thought, who better to guide these kids than someone who truly knows their power?" He looked at Abigail, then, eyes soft with affection. "And I thought I'd like to guide them together." Abigail's cheeks warmed. "He's more than a guide," she said. "He's someone who sees the world the way Mum did, a place where every story matters, where every child deserves to be heard." She reached across the table and slipped her hand into David's. I watched them exchange that look, one of shared purpose and mutual admiration, and felt a stirring of hope. Here was a partnership rooted not in status or ambition, but in kindness and service, the very values Eleanor had lived by. Over the next hour, we talked about classroom challenges, how to engage reluctant readers, how to spark curiosity in adolescents who felt the world was too large for them to explore. David spoke of creative exercises, having students write their own endings to fairy tales, encouraging group storytelling that built confidence. Abigail chimed in with her marketing insights, suggesting community outreach events to invite families to the foundation. I found myself leaning forward, enthralled by their collaborative energy. It felt familiar, like the early days with Eleanor, when we'd brainstorm house plans late into the night, fingers tracing blueprints and margins of library books. The connection between Abigail and David was a mirror of that partnership, shared vision, complementary strengths, mutual respect. When the conversation lulled, Abigail reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small, neatly folded note. "We have news," she said, her voice wavering with excitement. "We're expecting a baby." She opened the note and read aloud a letter from her obstetrician confirming a son due in the fall. "We want to name him Elliot," she said, eyes glistening. "After Mom, Eleanor. We want him to carry her name into the world." I felt the room tilt in that moment, the weight of grief lifting as a new legacy took shape. Elliot named for Eleanor a boy who would know his grandmother through stories and memories and the petals of spring tulips she once adored. I swallowed, hard tears forming as I reached out to rest my hand on Abigail's. "That's a beautiful name," I said, voice thick. She would be so proud. David squeezed my daughter's hand, his own eyes bright. "He'll grow up knowing his grandmother's stories," he said. "He'll know the value of kindness and literature because that's the world you showed us." I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, envisioning a toddler with daisies in his hair, listening to Eleanor's poems read aloud on the porch. I could almost hear her gentle narration weaving through the garden, the scent of rose petals and lavender rising with each verse. When I opened my eyes, Abigail was leaning against me, her head resting on my shoulder. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for giving us the chance to build this new family." I held her close and gazed at David, a man who understood the heart of our family's story. "Thank you," I said, "for loving her and for keeping her memory alive." We stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, which warmed the snow-melted paths of the garden. The rose bushes were budding again, pale green leaves unfurling like the first lines of a poem. Abigail and David walked side by side, their steps in sync, the promise of a child between them. I watched as David paused to brush a stray twig from Abigail's hair, his gesture tender and protective. As I wandered among the roses, I knelt to touch the soil where we'd planted tulip bulbs earlier. I pressed my fingers into the earth and whispered a quiet blessing for Elliot, that he would grow with Eleanor's love in his heart, that he would learn to find joy in words, and that he would know his grandfather's pride. When I stood, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky in shades of rose and lavender. Abigail called to me, her laughter ringing clear as she pointed out a crocus pushing through the cold ground. David joined them, kneeling beside the flower, his hand steady as he brushed the soil away. I felt a surge of gratitude for the paths of our family, winding fraught with sorrow, yet guided always by love. I realized that Eleanor's legacy was not just the charities or the poems, but the choices we made each day to plant tulips at her grave, to rewrite a will with compassion, to welcome new love into our lives. As twilight settled, I walked between rows of budding roses and tulips, each bud a promise of bloom. I paused at the edge of the garden, watching Abigail and David cradle that small crocus, their faces alight with the wonder of new beginnings. In that quiet moment, I felt the circle of our family close once more, not with a perfect return to what was, but with the enduring hope that love can bridge even the deepest divides, and that each generation can carry forward the legacy of those who came before. And as the stars began to emerge in the dusky sky, I knew that Eleanor's spirit lived on in every petal, every book opened, every promise made beneath the spring sun. Her story continued, woven into the lives of her daughter, her grandson-to-be, and the countless children who would learn to read, because she believed in the power of stories to heal and unite. Each evening, I settled into my favorite rocker on the veranda, the same chair Eleanor loved, its wicker arms worn smooth by her gentle touch. The garden lies before me in full bloom, rose bushes aflame with scarlet, and blush tulips nodding like sentinels along the path, and daffodils glowing in the last gold of sunset. A soft breeze carries the scent of lavender and new growth, and somewhere in the distance I hear the laughter of children, perhaps my grandson Elliot, chasing fireflies among the flower beds. In these moments of quiet, I can feel the full circle of our lives settling softly around me. It wasn't always this peaceful. I remember how money once exposed the worst in us, how Abigail's inheritance secured by birthright allowed ambition to overshadow empathy. I remember the cold ache of her absence at her mother's funeral, how her husband's priorities trumped the most sacred of family rituals. But losing that entitlement revealed her heart. Stripped of luxury and status, she rediscovered humility volunteering at the Reading Foundation, planting tulips on Eleanor's grave, and learning to live simply. Her transformation taught me that character isn't forged in comfort, but in adversity, and that true wealth lies not in dollars, but in deeds of kindness. Families are built on more than bloodlines. They are built on choice forgiveness and the courage to change. Eleanor always believed that people grow throughout their lives, that no mistake is too great to overcome if one has the will to learn and repair the damage. She taught me even in her final months that grace and patience could mend the deepest wounds. When Abigail returned asking forgiveness and offering her tears, she embodied that lesson. Together we rebuilt trust, brick by careful brick, tending our relationships as carefully as we tended the roses. I often think back to the day I called Philip to restore Abigail in my will, transforming legalese into a testament of earned renewal rather than unearned privilege. In that moment, I wasn't just rewriting documents. I was redefining what it meant to be a father. I was saying that love must demand integrity, that inheritance is not a right but a responsibility. Watching her kneel before me, gratitude mingling with regret, I realized that the most profound gifts are those we grant only when they match the recipient's readiness to receive them with honor. With Abigail's divorce finalized, her life took on a new rhythm, the modest apartment she now calls home, the clatter of her morning coffee at the corner cafe, the hum of printing presses at the small ad firm where she learned to value work that serves community rather than status. Each week she called not for financial aid, but for stories, an anecdote about a quirky coworker, a small triumph in her volunteer reading sessions, the first flutter of life she felt when she discovered she was expecting Elliot. Her laughter, once stifled by ambition, now bubbled freely, as light and genuine as any garden breeze. Then came David with his kind eyes and a teacher's heart, volunteering alongside Abigail at the Children's Reading Foundation. I saw in him the same quiet devotion Eleanor had shown kneeling beside shy readers, offering patience instead of judgment, treating every child as if they were his own. When Abigail introduced us, her face glowed with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. Their love was rooted in shared values, nurtured by respect and generosity, and it breathed new life into our family tapestry. When Abigail told me she was expecting a son and revealed she would name him Elliot in honor of his grandmother, my chest swelled with pride. In that choice, I heard Eleanor's gentle voice echoing across time, urging us to pass on her love of literature and children's laughter to the next generation. I pictured Elliot toddling among the roses, plucking petals with tiny fingers as I read him lines from Keats or Frost stories that helped him understand beauty, loss, and hope. Tonight, as the stars begin to pierce the twilight sky, I let my thoughts drift to the many voices that have shaped our journey. Eleanor's soft narration of bedtime tales, Abigail's bright soprano laughter at a silly childhood memory, David's steady encouragement of students finding their voices, and now the quiet stirrings of a new life in his mother's womb. These voices form a chorus of resilience and renewal, reminding me that love is the thread that binds our past, present, and future. Sometimes a neighbor stops by Mrs. Fenwick bearing a fresh loaf of bread, Pastor Henry with a thoughtful line of poetry tucked into his pocket, and we sit on the veranda together sharing stories and watching the garden's living art unfold. We speak of Eleanor as if she's beside us, her wisdom guiding our words. And in those shared moments I sense her smile lingering in the air, as real as the petals brushing my hand. I've learned that grief need not be a cage. It can be the soil in which compassion and forgiveness take root. When I tend the rose bushes, I remember pruning away what no longer serves growth, just as I once pruned Abigail from my will, only to graft her back on stronger and more resilient than before. Each sprig of greenery that emerges from last year's hard cut reminds me that life regenerates sometimes in unexpected ways if we give it a chance. Now, when I light a lantern on the porch at dusk, its soft glow seems to illuminate more than the night. It lights the path for our family, guiding us through the lessons we've learned and the promises we've made. It is a beacon for Elliot and any children who gather here one day, calling them into a home shaped by stories of redemption and hope. As the air cools and the garden settles into the hush of night, I lean back in the rocker and close my eyes. I breathe in the mingled scents of roses, earth, and lavender, savoring the moment for its quiet perfection. In this space, I feel the presence of those I've loved and lost, and the promise of those yet to come. I feel the pulse of life that Eleanor once called beauty's joy forever. And I know that because of her faith in growth and our willingness to wait and forgive, our family has been reborn. The future indeed feels bright again, like spring's first blossoms after a long winter, a testament to the enduring power of love to heal, to unite, and to inspire each new dawn.